Okay, let me say something about what we've tried to do here with this particular case. I think what I'd like you to think about a little bit is what we did with APV. We separated the cash flows into unlevered flows and tax shelters, tax shields from associated with debt. And in that particular case, we thought about, oh, we really can't separate them out, because we're not going to be selling off the tax shield. However, in this particular case, what we see with this particular project is government actually does allow them to sell off the tax shields, as it were, as a separate flow. And so what they've done is created a tax equity flow, which they sell off to investors, where it's the tax shields and they can use those tax shields to offset other income. And secondly, then we sort of talked about there's a residual equity cash flow, which also what they could do is sell a proportion of that to a minority investor and just be left with a relatively small residual from the whole total project. But again, what we're doing is dividing up free cash flow in this particular case into three different flows: EBITDA, which is the cash flow, taxes, and finally a production tax credit, and we sell off different parts of that to different investors to finance the project. I think it's an interesting application of this idea of valuing individual flows. Now, one of the things we didn't do is we actually didn't try to estimate a required rate of return for any of these things. We just did it based upon evaluate based on the IRR, and that's probably realistically the way it would have been evaluated by investors. You know, what's the IRR? Is it good enough for me to do it? And we saw that basically tax equity investors based 5.6. The minority investors somewhat around 7+%, and the residual that goes to EDP was almost 13%. So that's a pretty good return for each one of those investors. And again, part of discounting the cash flows gets us back to the same problem we had with APV and the tax shields. What's the right discount rate to discount the cash flow, those tax shields at? And so typically what people do is by default they just look at the residual cash flows to each one of the entities and talk about an IRR. Is that IRR high enough? Because a lot of times it's not going to be these are going to go to large investors. It's not going to be, these are not packages that would go to individual investors. Okay, so I think this is a useful example. Now the last session will just be a review of especially the equity part of the course. When we talked about the valuation part of the courses, that will be basically session 14. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon.